Finland has long captivated the world with its intriguing political stance, while placed right on the doorstep of the Soviet Union. And having fought multiple wars with it, it chose to remain outside the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, an alliance which defined its existence by opposing the Soviet Union, and has shaped the world's geopolitical landscape ever since its establishment in 1949. This decision, rooted in Finland's geopolitical considerations, is often referred to as finlandization, a term which can also be attributed to other countries besides Finland. Importantly, Finland's choices were not born of ideology, but of sheer necessity that also prevented their long-held dreams of forging a truly democratic government. So, what is the history that shaped Finland's relationship with Russia? What exactly is finlandization? And how did it prevent Finland from joining NATO? Let's roll. Finland's history has been defined by its harsh northern climate and its position as a crossroads north of the Baltic Sea. The competition for the control of the Baltic between Sweden and Muscovy between the 16th and 18th centuries saw Finland as a battleground between the two northern great powers. This centuries-long struggle culminated with Sweden's loss of its possessions in Estonia and the North German coast in the Great Northern War, during which Finland was occupied by the Muscovite forces of Peter the Great and subjected to a period of looting and destruction known as Y.Y.A, or Great Wrath. Sweden's attempts to regain its position as a great power saw it wage several wars against Russia, which would only cause Sweden to lose further territories from its Finnish parts to the Russian Empire, like the fortress city of Viborg, which had been founded by Sweden in 1293. During the Napoleonic Wars, Finland would be conquered by Russia, though it was made into an autonomous Grand Duchy of the Russian Empire. Thanks to this autonomy, Finland remained loyal to the Tsars in St. Petersburg, and during the reign of Alexander II, it would experience its golden age of Finnish national awakening under the reformist Tsar. However, in the 20th century, Finland's position of autonomy came under increasing pressure as reactionary Tsars and the rise of nationalism led to a desire to bring Finland firmly under Russian rule, owing to its location right next to St. Petersburg. The attempts at Russification would cause Finland to increasingly turn against the Tsar, and luckily for Finland, Russia was pushed into a civil war. Meanwhile, Finland managed to declare independence and was exceptionally prepared for such an outcome, owing to the existence of Finnish institutions and a class of civil servants. But the tensions presented in Russia were equally present in Finland, leading to the eruption of the Finnish Civil War between Red and White forces. However, German aid to the Whites tipped the scales in their favor, while the German plan to place their own monarch in charge of Finland would end with their surrender, concluding the First World War. And finally, the Finnish Republic was established. It faced significant challenges as it sought to solidify its governance and rebuild its war-torn economy. The Republic grappled with political divisions, social unrest, and the pressing need for economic recovery and reconstruction. In 1939, Finland found itself defending against the Soviet Union following an unprovoked Soviet invasion in what was known as the Winter War. The Finnish resistance would force the Soviets to be satisfied with just Eastern Karelia and Salla instead of the whole country. And one Red Army general is said to have remarked, "We have won just about enough ground to bury our dead." At the end of the Winter War, contact through German-occupied Norway would lead to the beginning of the Finnish military cooperation with Germany, as Finland found no other nations ready to help it with reclaiming its lost lands. In 1941, with the German invasion of the Soviet Union, Finland joined the war as a non-Axis member, though the German defeats and Soviet advance into Finland prompted it to switch sides in September 1944, which included a war in Lapland to drive out the German forces that had been stationed there for the purpose of capturing Murmansk and its vital railway. Finland would come out of the war independent, unlike the Baltics and Eastern Europe, but this independence came at a cost. Finlandization, the process by which a smaller or less powerful sovereign state comes to abide by a more powerful neighbor's foreign policy and rules while retaining its independence. With the end of the Continuation War and the Moscow Armistice of 1944, the Valvonkomissio was established, meaning supervisory commission that oversaw Finland's obedience to the terms of the Soviet armistice. It had both British and Soviet representatives, though the Brits gave the Soviets a free hand. The Supervisory Commission oversaw the withdrawal of German forces from northern Finland and became the Soviet Union's watchful eyes in the country, backed by the Soviet Red Army. Disobeying their requests would have risked war for Finland, as the Soviet troops stationed in the lease base of Porkala posed a threat to the Finnish capital. The Commission demanded the disbandment of political and civic organizations deemed fascist by the Soviets. Media censorship also began at the Soviets' request, with films and theater plays considered anti-Soviet being banned or edited. And the 1945 elections of the Finnish parliament saw the coalition of communists and leftists join under the banner of the SKDL. It would go on to become the largest party in the Finnish parliament. The communists attempted to seize power of the Finnish state through appointing other leftists in government positions, while removing opposition, and the appointment of Y.Y.A Leino as interior minister. Already during 1944, Finnish army officers had been establishing weapons caches in preparation for possible Soviet occupation of Finland. But in 1945, the now communist-controlled state police uncovered the weapons caches and charged over 1,000 officers of the Finnish army. By April 1948, tensions in Finland escalated, with the pending vote on the Agreement of Friendship, Cooperation and Mutual Assistance with the Soviet Union, otherwise referred to as the Y.Y.A Treaty, under which Finland was obliged to resist armed attacks from Germany or its allies, against itself or against the Soviet Union.
Northwards now to Finland, where discussions on a mutual assistance pact with Russia are continuing. Members of the Finnish delegation returned from Moscow to report progress, and at Helsinki, President Paasikivi arrives to hear the Russian proposals. And so, Finland's parliament and people await the next development from beyond the borders of the USSR.
Many in Finland were fearful of the treaty's consequences, as in February 1948, Czechoslovakia had seen a communist takeover. During the events leading up to the vote on the Y.Y.A Treaty by the Finnish parliament, the communist Finnish Interior Minister, Leino, initially requested the military to guard weapons stores to prevent a potential right-wing coup. However, this heightened security led to rumors of a leftist coup instead. Consequently, the military, along with the police, were deployed to protect the weapons stores, while warships aimed their cannons towards Helsinki. Interestingly, on the day before the Y.Y.A Treaty vote, Minister Leino requested a withdrawal of the military readiness he had previously sought, prompting the president to argue in favor of strengthening it instead. Otherwise, perhaps the left was ready to overthrow the government entirely. But in the end, the Finnish Republic would survive without a coup, as the communists were not able to fire enough government officials without a legal justification, while the communist interior minister would be sacked by a non-confidence vote. An additional factor to the survival of the Finnish Republic was Joseph Stalin's lack of support for a communist uprising, owing to the pragmatic fact that he didn't believe the Finnish communists could achieve it on their own. Economically, Finland had to repay damages caused to the Soviet Union during its invasion alongside the Germans. At the same time, it was forbidden from receiving Marshall aid from the United States due to Soviet pressure. Finland would end up paying all its war reparations to the Soviet Union, which were paid in the form of industrial machinery, ships, paper, and wood industry products worth over $200,000 billion. In addition, Finland had to give away everything of value, including factories and motor vehicles, located in the lands lost to the Soviet Union, like Eastern Karelia. These debts would be paid off by 1952, though the reparation payments had laid the foundations for flourishing bilateral trade between Finland and the Soviet Union, where Finland exported industrial goods in exchange for Soviet crude oil. Culturally, Finland would see itself censoring literature and other publications that were deemed anti-Soviet. The book Gulag Archipelago was, for example, not on sale in Finland, since the infamous novel portrayed the Soviet Gulag system in a very harsh light. Militarily and diplomatically, Finland retained a neutral position, though in accordance with the Y.Y.A treaty, Finland officially was to defend against the enemies of the Soviet Union, meaning NATO. It was also due to this position that in the case of a war between the two nuclear superpowers, Finland would have been a target of Western strikes. In practice, it also maintained an army prepared to defend against an invasion from the Soviet Union. Under the Prime Minister turned President Paasikivi, Finland would see the development of the Paasikivi Doctrine, according to which Finland was to be a neutral state that retained friendly relations with the Soviet Union. Paasikivi would be succeeded by the Prime Minister Kekkonen in 1956, under whom the Finnish doctrine of neutrality became known as the Paasikivi-Kekkonen Doctrine, as he continued his predecessor's policy towards the Soviet Union. Following the death of Stalin in 1953, Finland would join the United Nations and the Nordic Council in 1955. In addition, the Soviet Union would return the rented military base at Porkala the following year in 1956. President Kekkonen would become the most influential single president in Finnish history. In 1958, he would end a diplomatic crisis with the Soviet Union by meeting its leader, Nikita Khrushchev, in person. And he would, going forward, only appoint governments which would not seem threatening to the Soviets. The Finnish presidential election of 1962 led to another diplomatic crisis between Finland and the Soviets, as the Soviets wanted Kekkonen to continue as president, which ended in the Soviets dropping their demand for negotiations, and the presidential candidate opposing Kekkonen dropped out, leading to Kekkonen being elected for another term. Famously, Kekkonen made extensive use of sauna diplomacy. According to one story, when the Soviet leader Khrushchev came to Helsinki to celebrate Kekkonen's 60th birthday, the Finnish president kept him in the sauna until 5 o'clock in the morning, and at the end of the visit, a communique by the Soviet government expressed its preparedness to support Finland's desire to integrate with the West economically. Kekkonen had maintained Finland's neutrality through his doctrine, but by the 1970s, the problems in his system began to show. Finnish political doctrine had come to rely in large part on Kekkonen being president, and he had begun to act in an increasingly authoritarian manner, as he saw himself as the guarantor of Finnish-Soviet relations. In the 1974 presidential election, an exception law was used to elect Kekkonen into a third term. This was because of him declining to become a candidate in another normal election, as he was tired of the mud wrestling of the presidential game with the electors. The same occurred during the 1978 elections.
Kekkonen, Kekkonen, Kekkonen. Kekkonen, 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 Kekkonen. Kekkonen, 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 Kekkonen.
In 1981, Kekkonen would attempt to topple the government of Prime Minister Mauno Koivisto, but he refused to step down as long as he enjoyed the parliament's confidence, while the president's ailing health led him to stand down from his demand as he was too tired to continue fighting the prime minister. Months later, Kekkonen would resign for health reasons, while the Prime Minister Koivisto would be elected in as the new president in 1982. The exit of Kekkonen from the presidency was the first sign of the loosening of Finlandization, as he used his authority to maintain this policy to the increasing detriment of the Finnish Republic's law-based governance. While Kekkonen was president between 1956 and 1981, the Finnish parliament remained dominated by the Social Democratic Party, the Agrarian League, and the SKDL. The 1982 presidential election marked the first time since the end of the Second World War that the Soviet Union had not influenced the election. Koivisto and his government would fix the problems that had arisen with the Finnish presidency under Kekkonen, and the strong legal powers of the president were diminished to a more symbolic position, while also nominally being in charge of foreign policy. Through these reforms, Finland became a parliamentary democracy compared to the past's more presidential democracy. In addition, the presidential elections were changed from an electoral vote to a direct election, Now, instead of electing electors, who elected the president? The people would directly vote for their presidential candidate, and the candidate with the majority of the popular vote would become president. Following these reforms, Finland's elected parliament became the most powerful authority, which was not responsible to the president. A second factor in the weakening of Finlandization was the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. As the new Russian Federation descended into political and economic chaos, Finland used this window of opportunity to join the European Union in 1995, after a referendum showed the majority's support for doing so. But Russia still remained as a lingering influence. It was likely the history of cooperation with its eastern neighbor and the beneficial position of diplomatic neutrality, which probably contributed to the Finnish decision to not join NATO despite bordering Russia. Whereas the Baltic countries' decision to join NATO as soon as possible was driven by a history of occupation and Russification. Finland's mostly peaceful relations with the Soviet Union during the Cold War made the prospect of NATO membership seem unnecessary. Also, finally, with the fall of the Soviet Union, the embargo on anti-Soviet literature and press was lifted. Finland would go on to become one of the most free countries in the world in terms of the freedom of press. In 2008, Russian forces attacked Georgia in the contested region of South Ossetia. In the aftermath, Finnish Prime Minister Matti Vanhanen from the Centre Party, the renamed Agrarian League Party of Kekkonen, reiterated that Finland had no plans to join NATO and stated that the main lesson of the war was the need for closer ties to Russia. By 2008, Finland had grown in large part to become a part of the West economically and also increasingly militarily. In the 2006 presidential elections, candidate Sauli Niinisto from the National Coalition Party supported NATO membership, while Tarja Halonen from the Social Democratic Party opposed it on the basis of not rocking the status quo. However, in 2007, Finland's military saw various technical preparations for NATO under pro-NATO defense minister Jyri Häkämies. There were a lot of prominent politicians advocating both for joining NATO and against it. It was certainly a difficult decision to make. While Finnish politicians continued to debate the question of NATO membership without concrete action, the Finnish military saw ever-increasing modernization and westernization. It ranged from the purchase of American fighter jets like the FA-18 and later the F-35, costing millions of euros, to the introduction of NATO call signs for all soldiers. This all changed when Russian forces entered Ukraine on February 24, 2022. The debate was over. Political pressure in favor of joining NATO grew to an overwhelming majority, and the Finnish government would come to the conclusion that Russia could no longer be considered a trustworthy partner. Finland was already part of the West, as it had joined sanctions against Russia over Crimea in 2014, and a Russian invasion of neutral Ukraine left Finland with little choice. As Ukraine fought for its existence, it surely reminded many in Finland of the stories of the Winter War and how Finland had to fight alone against the Soviet Union. It is an ordinary Tuesday in Helsinki on the 17th of May 2022, as people of the Finnish capital go about their day at work and elsewhere. However, within a government building, a single man sits on his desk with a paper in front of him and a camera pointing at him to record a moment for the history books. As he signs his name on the paper, over 78 years of Finnish foreign policy instantly comes to an end. Ever since the end of the Second World War, Finland adopted a policy of Finlandization. This neutrality allowed Finland to retain its independence and trade both with the West and the Soviet Union, but maintaining this neutrality came at a cost to its democracy. It was the Soviet Union's collapse which allowed Finland to further integrate with the West, while it was Putin's attempts to restore Soviet power through the invasion of Ukraine, which pushed Finland to end Finlandization and join NATO after 74 years of careful balancing. Now, have you ever asked yourself why Finland wouldn't want Karelia back? Watch this video next to figure out why. And this is my Patreon map. Everyone here has contributed greatly to my channel, and I am most appreciative. Thank you all. Your perspective out.